Hello and welcome to the Hardy Woods Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Fraser. Oak ecology and the current state of oak forests in the East are a big part of what we talk about this show. For new listeners, we recently published an interview with Dr. Daniel Day where we discussed the history of oak forests in the eastern U.S. and the decline that oak forests are facing today. So have a listen back to that when you have time. But today we're going to talk about one of the most prominent efforts to manage and hopefully reverse these declines. I'm talking about the White Oak Initiative, and my guest today is Dr. Jeffery Stringer. Dr. Stringer got his PhD in 1993 from the University of Kentucky in plant physiology, biochemistry, and molecular biology. He's a professor at UK. He's the chairman of the UK School of Forestry and Natural Resources. He's the director of Kentucky's Master Logger Program, the managing editor of Kentucky Woodlands Magazine, and on the board of directors for the White Oak Initiative. Dr. Stringer, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
So to start our discussion off today, I think we ought to bring listeners up to speed on what makes up the oak-dominated forests of the eastern woods, maybe starting with the history of how this ecosystem came to be. We've talked a little bit on this show about how fire and disturbance have been part of the ecosystem from the beginning, but Dr. Stringer, can you tell us how sunlight and soil disturbance especially are critical to oak forests and how it relates to the history?
Yeah, so in order for us to be able to regenerate and grow and sustainably produce oak forest, you have to have a certain amount of sunlight that gets to the forest floor. And the reason that's important is because oaks and oak forests regenerate by developing seedlings and saplings prior to a harvest, for example. And if you don't have those seedlings and saplings in place, you're not going to be able to regenerate the oaks. And so that requires a certain amount of sunlight to filter through the forest and hit the forest floor where the seedlings are at. So that light regime becomes really important, okay? Now, one of the reasons we have so much oak now is because historically we disturb the forest quite a bit. It's widely known, and others have probably talked about the fact that we had back in the 1800s, early 1900s, you had a lot of disturbance there, whether it was fire, a lot of intensive logging, livestock grazing. We had things like iron furnaces, for example, where they were using fuel, generating charcoal from the forest. So there was a whole lot of disturbance. And what that disturbance did was it took care of or removed a lot of the thin-barked beech and maple and those kind of things that are typically growing in the understory now because they're tolerant of shade that we have on our forest. And so because a lot of those were removed, you had a much lighter condition on the ground. And so with that light that was prevalent on the ground, it allowed oak seedlings and saplings to develop, right? That has what has produced our forest that we have now. So, run the clock forward 100 years, which is now, or 120, 130, 140, it's produced the dominating oak forest we have at this time. And so that past disturbance was related to improving the light on the ground, which led to the development of oak seedlings and saplings. So when that forest was cut or those woods were cut and harvesting and those kind of things, oak prevailed. And when Smokey the Bear hit, quite successful, right? So we quit burning. Mm-hmm. We don't have iron furnaces anymore. Aren't grazing in the woods all willy-nilly. So those disturbance conditions went away. What happened over time then is that occurred over the last 50 years. We've had a buildup of, maples and beech and other species like that can tolerate more shade. They develop in the understory and start to grow in the midstory, put more shade on the ground, and that basically deteriorates the condition of our oaks. That acorns will hit the ground, they'll produce small seedlings, and those seedlings will languish in that deep shade. So we can't, what we call recruit, we can't grow or recruit those small oak seedlings into larger oak seedlings that can ultimately regenerate, because all you have is 1 foot or 2 foot tall oak seedlings that are decrepit and starting to die, and then you have a harvest. They simply can't grow enough to keep up with their competitors. And this is more important as you increase the quality of the site. So real low quality sites, dry, ridge tops, things of that nature. As you move to to the Ozarks, for example, we have a lot of that, okay? And in those forests, oaks don't have as hard a time because there's not as many competitors. There's not as much strong beech. There's not as much, strong maple competition. But when you go eastward from the Ozarks, and when you go on our high quality sites like east facing slopes, things of that nature, those oaks have a lot of competition there, and we simply can't get the buildup of advanced regeneration or those seedlings and saplings because of the light conditions.
Yeah, and I actually had a note here to ask you about that, and I think you explained it really well. I had a note that the Ozarks oak forests are in better shape because of the lower site index, which I think might be a little bit counterintuitive to some people, but I guess it just comes down to competition.
Yeah, and so one of the species that's real prevalent in the east that we're used to having around is like yellow poplar, right, or tulip poplar, and that's a big time competitor to oaks on higher quality or even medium quality sites. So what's funny about this, as you get lower site qualities in the Ozarks compared to what we have in the Appalachians, or in a lot of eastern U.S., the yellow poplar, if you look at its range map, stops at like the Mississippi River. So they don't have that
Mm.
competitor over there either. So you combine those two things together, and it's just a better condition for oaks overall. And they have less of a hard time regenerating on some of those sites over there compared to what we have east of there.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. And but I kind of wonder how does, like, especially looking at the White Oak Initiative, how would we quantify the decline of oak regeneration in the East with all that competition?
Yeah, so what we did as part of the White Oak Initiative, one of the first things it did was develop an assessment from the standpoint of white oaks, and the assessment of their where they're currently growing, where you have oak forest, and where they're regenerating and where they aren't. So we did that analysis based on data from the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. That's a program that some listeners may be familiar with, certainly foresters are, but we have a grid of plots put throughout the U.S. That we follow forest development. Okay. And that's reoccurring data, and we refresh it all the time and that kind of thing. So we use that data to tell us, okay, where were the white oak forests currently occurring based on the overstory of white oak that's present, and then which of those stands that had white oak in the overstory had adequate regeneration in them or not. Okay, so we use that data set then to determine where we need to prioritize management, meaning where we're getting good oak regeneration, for example, we don't have to do much, or where we need to do a lot of work, or some work or a lot of work to make sure that we've got the regeneration there. So when we cut those forests, then the oak will regenerate themselves. So we use that analysis. There's other analysis that have been done as well, but we did an analysis of that that's included in the White Oak Initiative's assessment and conservation plan that we developed specifically to give us a roadmap for managing for white oak.
So we've mentioned it a couple times without defining it here. Let's talk about how what the White Oak Initiative is, how it started, and who the players are.
Yeah. So what the White Oak Initiative is basically a coming together of partners of white oak dependent industries, conservation groups that are interested in white oak, universities doing research on white oak, basically all of those that are concerned about conservation of our oak forest or use of our oak forest, like industries. Okay, so that's who it's composed of. And then it was founded. What we did was back in 2015, 2017, I did two different sustainability conferences or workshops on white oak, specifically to get information in front of the industry primarily, but certainly those that were white oak dependent solely or partially. Cooperages, for example, being totally dependent upon it, right? Flooring manufacturing being partially dependent upon it. So we got those those individuals together, as well as conservation groups, that kind of thing, and just gave them information on what we knew about the white oak, about oak in general, and white oak as far as like who owns it, what's it look like in the future, what are some challenges to it, and that kind of thing. So we did that basic awareness and education, if you will, and it was from that second meeting that several of us got together, American Forest Foundation, myself, and philanthropic organization called the Dendry Fund, which is actually a part of Brown-Forman. For those who don't know Brown-Forman, they may have heard of Jack Daniels. So Jack Daniels is one of the primary products of Brown-Forman, who's based in Louisville. Since I'm a Forester, I like to promote Old Forester, which is one of their brands as well. But anyway, so the three of us, the University of Kentucky, myself, American Forest Foundation, and the president, Tom Martin at the time, and the Dendry Fund came together with the idea of developing something that would start to deal with this, with this issue. And from that, we developed the White Oak Initiative. We brought together these key stakeholders from industry and consulting foresters and wildlife groups, because the cool thing about white oak is, of course, it's a great timber species, but from a hard mass production, an acorn, it's the most palatable acorn we have. So it's good for wildlife. So everybody can get behind white. It's a great species to get behind because serves purposes for all kinds of objectives. So we got that group together in the fall of 2017 and formed the White Oak Initiative, and it's been rolling ever since. And the objective of the initiative ultimately is to provide for sustainability of white oak. Now, white oak's not going extinct. We're not saying that's the issue. It's not like some species like longleaf pine, right? That you've got to replant it because the acreage of longleaf pine forest, really got decimated. We've got lots of white oak forest now, and it grows over a big area, right? Information, though, analysis, research, all that shows that over time we're going to be losing some of that. And the White Oak Initiative exists to provide for sustainability and availability of white oak. It's trying to keep white oak as prominent as possible, right? It's never going to go away unless we have something weird happen, which could these days that could be the case, right? But it's just a matter of trying to keep it around. That's what the white oak objective is. And to do that, as most listeners are probably aware, it takes a lot of collaboration, right? I mean, you have to, just a few foresters out there talking about it, or a few loggers doing this, not going to get it done. So you need everybody involved, and the initiative is designed to do that, provide that.
Yeah, so you mentioned the unique ecological roles that white oak provides, in terms of its very palatable acorn and especially young oak forests. I think with the insect communities, that thrive in that for pollinators and for ground nesting birds. But economically, it's a really unique product. You mentioned flooring, furniture, cabinetry, as far as veneer quality stuff goes. But the bourbon barrel, I think, is something that most people can get behind. So what is it about white oak that makes it the only thing you can use to make a bourbon barrel?
Well, so first of all, for Kentucky straight bourbon, which I'm in Kentucky, right? So that's a big deal. But when people think about bourbon, they often think about that, right? So by federal law, to make bourbon, you have to, straight bourbon, you have to age it, the whiskey, the raw whiskey, right? So raw whiskey you take at least 50% corn mash, right? And you distill it. That's called, if it's 100% corn mash, you call it white lightning or moonshine, right? And so you make that distillate, right? And then to turn it into bourbon, you put it in a fresh charred oak cask, and that's by federal law, and it's aged in that cask. It has to be at least aged for 2 years. Most producers will keep it 4 or 5 years or whatever, right? And what that white oak barrel does in that aging process, it gives that raw whiskey 70% of its taste profile. Okay, so the mellowness you take, that mellowness, and it's got different tastes, in it. That's produced by being in that oak barrel. So 70% of what we call the taste profile comes from the oak, the white oak, and of course all the color, right? Because it comes out of the still, it's like it says white lightning, it's clear, right? So in many ways, I don't make a big deal of that, but I could and say that the bourbon is actually a wood product, okay? And now the corn growers, of course, argue with me about that and that kind of thing, and rightly so. So the oak itself is important. Now the reason we use white oak instead of the red oak species, so you got a number of red oak species. White oak, we use white oak because when you produce a barrel that's going to have liquid in it for 2, 3, 4, 5, in the case of Pappy Van Winkle, like 23 years or something, right? That barrel has to hold that liquid. And white oak, because of its cell structure, okay, what it has, the vessels in it, and the cells in it are occluded. That's just the way it grows, and that holds liquid very well. Okay, so you use it for that reason, plus some of the attributes of the flavor that it gives as well. So white oak is unique from that standpoint, and the majority of the barrels that are made for our whiskey industry and our bourbon industry are white oak. The vast majority of them would be. Okay, so that's why we use it, because the taste profile, and just as importantly, because it holds. You can make a barrel that holds liquid. It doesn't leak.
Right. So we know now kind of what we're looking at losing and why the if we're don't take action. So let's talk about what the White Oak Initiative found and the activities now to help turn this around.
Yeah. So like I said, there's lots of white oak out there now, and I think this is an important point. We're not running out of to the distillers and stuff where they're going to still be able to cut oak and make barrels and all that kind of thing, right? And so what we see when we look at the data, what it tells us is that we have a lot of forests now that are 70, 80, 90 years old in the eastern U.S., and the ones that are, you got a lot of forests that have white oak in it, some just a very slim amount, and some, dominated by it, 30, 40, 50%, that kind of thing. So when you look at the age, if you look at the age distribution of all our forests out there, we find, the white oak, the ones that contain white oak are that 70, 80, 90 years old, right? And they're aging over time. Well, the problem is there's not many young stands coming to fill the gap, right? So as you let these forests age, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years from now, there's not a lot of acreage coming behind it to replace it, okay? And some of those forests, especially in the east, that are currently oak that are 70, 80, 90 years old, when you harvest those stands now, you don't get a lot of oak coming back, right? So we see the situation, okay, we're losing oak over time. And it is important to know that it's not going extinct. We have plenty of growing stock now, okay? But this is an issue that's going to hit us later on, after I'm dead, okay? So I'm mid-60s, right? I'm not going to see a problem, right? But my kids will. And anybody that's aware of forestry, right? So we got to get on it now, because if you wait to try to deal with the problem 60 years from now, you're too late, right? I mean, so it's one of those things. It's one of those weird situations where we've actually got somebody paying attention to forest management when you should pay attention to it, which is 50 years before you need to. You actually have a problem, because you wait to have a problem, it's too late, right? So, we had a cool group of stakeholders, those that, produce barrels, for example, and, distillers and others, that the normal industry and conservation groups that realize and get this, right, and are willing to do something about it now, okay? So that's important to say, okay? It's not an immediate problem, it's a future problem, okay? So what we did with the White Oak Initiative is we went out and, collected data to determine where geographically we knew we were having more problems. For example, in the Ozarks, we've already talked about, not a lot of problem growing white oak there. I mean, they do have some stands that they have problems with, certainly, right? But compared to east of that, and certainly, you get in the Appalachians, the Virginias, and the Eastern Kentuckys and Tennessees, and Western North Carolina, all that, right? We have a lot more stands that have white oak in it now that we can't regenerate very well. So what we did was we developed this analysis, was actually done by Dr. Ben Knapp, and Dr. Lance Vickers at the University of Missouri did this analysis for it. We currently have Dr. Vickers is currently on faculty here in the University of Kentucky, but before that, they did this analysis for us to determine where white oak was regenerating well and where it wasn't, right? So when you've got that map, that allows you to say, okay, if we were going to prioritize dollars and effort, right, and work, where does that need to be geographically, right? Okay.
Right.
And so we did that analysis and looked at that to basically structure a roadmap of where we, and when I say we, I mean collectively we, right, needs to be working at, right? Where we need to put ourselves to work. So that is in that assessment and conservation plan that you can get at whiteoakinitiative.org, and we'll mention that web address at the end as well. But you can get that assessment plan there that's got this kind of information in it. We also did a number of other things. We looked at landowner preference, like what issues we know certain management needs to be done. Are landowners accepting of that or not? Those kind of things, right? Where do we have markets to support all this? Do we have foresters? Is there enough money being spent by state governments, right, to have enough foresters on the ground to help assist landowners, that kind of thing? So we try to look at do you have federal cost share money in place, right? Farm bill money, right? EQIP and those kind of things to be able to support practices that aren't, that don't provide an economic outcome, right, for the landowner. So we looked at all those things, right? And if you read that assessment and conservation plan, it's got all that kind of information in it, right? And then we've also developed, a set of practices. Here's the different practices you need to use, in certain situations to be able to promote and regenerate and grow oak. So we've got all that as well. And we're in the process now of finalizing, landowner materials, educational materials on, how to manage oak and silvicultural practices to manage oak, and what do you need foresters for, and what's an oak friendly harvest look like, and all those kind of things, as well as training materials for professionals as well. So we're trying to hit all those different, it's a big thing, right? Forestry involves a lot of different people and stakeholders, and you have to have a lot of things in place to make it work. And one of the initiative is trying to do things that provide the resources for all that, for all those stakeholders, and for practices to start happening.
So just in broad strokes with those practices, I'm guessing that a big part of it would be something like mid-story removal, which is something we talk about a lot on this, and increasing that light. And I think it's so interesting that we can, my last guest on our podcast here was someone who studies a golden-winged warbler, which is a little bird that inhabits young oak forests in particular. And, that's just such a different group from bourbon manufacturers to bird watchers, right? We all have a vested interest in this ecosystem, sustaining itself. I just think that's
well, don't leave out the bats, right? So we got bats, and so there's oaks are so important in our from the forest ecosystem standpoint, right? We've ratcheted them out because of what we did in the past. We've jacked up the amount of oaks that are in the woods, right? We've kind of got used to that, and the biology of the system has followed that, right? And so there's lots of those oaks, and like white oaks, add lots of attributes out there for a whole lot of different things, right? And so if you keep white oak there, you keep those attributes there that help, whether it's a golden winged warbler or northern long-eared bat or Indiana bat or the so game species, right? Deer, turkey, right? Grouse, all those kind of things, right? So it puts a lot of attributes there that they're important for a whole lot of people, right? And just more so than just the worrying about the whiskey industry or making oak flooring.
For sure. And so you mentioned that so much of White Oak Range is privately owned, and I'm hoping that some of our listeners are people that own some land, some forest, or at least make some decisions about forest in the White Oak Range. So just in a broad stroke, how can landowners recognize signs of white oak health or decline in a stand and their property?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'll mention this real quick, and then try to answer a difficult question. I guess is we're currently developing a mobile app and associated website specifically for landowners to be able to assess their woodlands for white oak and its health and those kind of things, right? And how to get help and all that kind of deal, right? So first thing I would say that landowners need to identify whether they have white oak or not, right? That's one thing. And we've got Landowners for Oaks series of publications available at whiteoakinitiative.org that allow landowners to be able to identify different oaks, and tells them what their options, how to do exactly what you've had, like how to assess their woods, for oak, right? And so one of the things that if you're a savvy enough landowner and you know what white oak looks like, right? With leaves are out, it's not too bad, right? So you can generally do that, right? But one of the things I would say that if you go out in your woods and you got a white oak woods, or you got a woods that got scattered white oak in it and that kind of thing, look to determine whether you've got any small seedlings present or not, right? Okay. Uh, and because what's necessary to adequately regenerate those forests at some point is you have oak seedlings, white oak seedlings, that are 3, 4, 5, 6 foot tall or bigger, right? And so a landowner can walk out there and kind of assess their regeneration situation, right? Do they see any white oak seedlings on the forest floor? Are they all 6 inches tall, or do you have bigger ones or whatever? And that'll give you some idea about where you're at from the standpoint of being able to do long-term regeneration of oaks. Okay. Now I'd say pretty quickly, and I think most people are aware, some of our the management practices that are needed, for a lot of our species, but certainly for the oaks. I mean, it's not that easy. And so I would really advise most landowners, if they're interested, to make sure they get a forester out there, get somebody that's knowledgeable about this, that can help them assess the situation and give them options. Because I think it's really hard to do without that. There's a number of us that have been in the profession and dealing with this, and we have hard enough time ourselves with it, right? And it's really hard for landowners. I think you can assess things, but if you really want to get into management and that kind of thing, and do a deep dive into assessment, you got to get a forester out on site. Get professional help.
Get professional help, exactly, especially as it relates to a potential timber harvest. Because I work in the woods, and a lot of what we do when we do a harvest here in Virginia and West Virginia is to make sure that we get that oak regeneration post harvest. And I think that a lot of it comes down to managing competition, right? Like, so it's mid-story removal, but maybe herbicide, maybe underplanting.
Yeah, there's lots of it. We have 10 different practices, and there's sub practices, that kind of thing that we have publications on. Like I said, that Landowner for Oak series talks about it, right? And so there's different practices you can put in place. Some of them associated with a harvest, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. And then some things that need to be done outside of a harvest to make sure that your oak's going to regenerate or your oak's going to grow, and those kind of things, right? And so harvesting is a big part of this, obviously, and harvesting always has to be done in a way that's mindful. In this case, we're talking about oaks. It's mindful of oak regeneration and growth, okay? And it takes trained foresters, involved, and trained professionals involved to be able to advise that and do that, And certainly, if you're going to, harvesting is a great tool. We use it all the time, but it is a tool, and you got to know how to use that tool. Right.
So we can see what White Oak Initiatives do in terms of developing these and getting information out to landowners and out to other stakeholders. But I do have to ask, like, when we're looking at a question that's as long term as white oak decline and landscape wide, then what would success in, let's say, the next 50 years look like for the White Oak Initiative?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We ask ourselves all the time, what's reasonable, right? What kind of goals can we shoot for? So I would say this, that we know we're making a change if we start to see more oak-friendly practices getting done on the ground and the amount of acres of those increase. Okay, you mentioned mid-story removal. That's something that we've, a number of researchers started looking at. It really started with northern red oak, and we started to apply it to white oak here back at, in 2000. And so, that's a big practice being used, and we can track that a lot of times, because a lot of times it is a practice that costs money. A lot of landowners will use farm bill money to help offset that cost and that kind of thing. So working with state agencies, we can track the amount of acreage where those white oak friendly practices are getting done. Okay. So as we see an uptick in that, or if we don't see an uptick in that, right, it's going to be worrisome. Okay. And then ultimately, you can look at those kind of practices, how much those are getting done, but we ought to be able to see. I mentioned earlier that forest inventory and analysis, that analysis that the U.S. Forest Service does in conjunction with states to look at the growth and development of their forest, right? And that's that's going on a continual basis, right? They're doing it in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and all the states in the East. And so we should able over time to see more stands, right, where the oak regeneration situation gets better. So the FIA system, if you will, gives us a mechanism of monitoring an increase in the acreage where we're seeing oak regeneration develop in. Okay. All right.
Okay.
We talked about oak friendly harvest. Well, if you do the right work up front, you have the harvest done in the right way, you're going to regenerate more oak forest. So we ought to be able to see that in our forest inventory analysis data over time. Now the problem with all this is it takes time. I mean, it's that seeing that in that inventory data is going to take 10, 20 years, that kind of thing, for us to be able to start to see it. Okay. So, but you got to be working now and realizing if we do these practices, it's going to result in a change, but we're not going to be able to see that change, for some time, because these are big picture things, man. They're taking place over a big geographic area. Forests take time to develop. White oak's a slow grower, unfortunately, right? And so it's going to take time to see these, the impact of all this work, right? And but the key thing now is, we know from research that if you do these things, we're going to improve the situation. So we got to have faith in that, right? Do the practices, get the landowners engaged, get them engaged with foresters, get loggers engaged. They know what they're doing. Get the forester logger connection going, right? And so we get things done in a way that we know is going to improve the situation. And we'll see that improvement, a little bit out in the future, in the data collection that we're currently doing.
I was going to ask you if there were any resources to point landowners or forest managers to, but I think that you really did, because it comes down to, reaching out to your state foresters, and everyone's contributing data to FIA. And I think there's a lot of consensus about what needs to be done. It comes down to getting it done and to everyone knowing the situation on the ground.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of I think that's right. And I think the good thing about it is in our neck of the woods, so to speak, right? So, the foresters were the state agency foresters, consulting foresters, industry foresters, all of that, right? They have some idea how to grow white oak and how to manage oak forest, because we've been at this gig for a while, right? We're improving our sophistication there, certainly, right? And we want to continue to do that. But I mean, it would be hard for me to believe that if in the territory we're talking about here, if you went to your state agency, if you went to a consultant, you're going to have foresters there that know how to manage oak, and it would shock me if you didn't, right? And so I think you can feel comfortable. Landowners in our area can feel comfortable. They go to get help. Those foresters, got some idea how to assess things and some idea how to develop management plans, that will secure oak, right, and be able to manage and tend oak. So that's a good thing, right? Some of our landowners maybe in some other states, right, where hardwoods aren't as prevalent, they still have them, but not as prevalent. They may not have as good a background there, in the management. But I feel secure that, when you're talking about Western Virginia, West Virginia, Western Virginia, in Kentucky and Tennessee and Western North Carolina, southern, southeast Ohio. I mean, Pennsylvania, those foresters, are well aware of oak management.
I know that Virginia, we have a hardwood initiative that's really heavily focused on oak regeneration.
Yeah, we work with them. Matter of fact, the state foresters on the executive committee of the White Oak Initiative, right? And so if he doesn't, if his outfit doesn't, they're in trouble, right? So I feel comfortable about that, and even private, even consultants and industry foresters are getting on board with this, and should be a pretty good situation to be able to help landowners effectively manage oak.
Right, and I think that's what's so inspiring really about the White Oak Initiative is when you've got academia, you've got active foresters, you've got bringing in loggers, you're bringing in bird enthusiasts. Like they're pretty and whiskey makers. Like these are fairly diverse group of stakeholders, and everyone can pretty much agree on what we'd like to see. So I don't know. It's a lot to be optimistic about
Yeah,
there.
I think the big
If we can get it
right. I think the big thing is just keeping white oak on the landscape, right? Now, the bat and the bird people don't care whether you're making a grade one butt log or not, right? That's irrelevant, but they'll take it, right? So we'll all take white oak, and the bird people are going to get theirs, and the bat people are going to get theirs, and wood people are going to get ours, and that kind of thing. So, it's something we can all get behind, which is like you said, it's kind of odd. That you have all those that divergence, right, and that variability and diversity associated with stakeholders that are interested in white oak, right? And you can all get in the conference, you can all get together on doing this, right? Okay, so and doing the practice you need to manage for it. So that's kind of a cool thing because that doesn't always happen, you know.
It really is, and hopefully we can all gather around a nice bottle of bourbon
Yeah, there you
and
go. So yeah, keep
agree we did something
keep
good.
that right.
Um, exactly. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I think that was a really good introduction for our listeners to the White Oak Initiative and what y'all are doing. And I'm sure that there's going to be another time where I'm going to have more questions I'd like to ask you. And I appreciate you making yourself available. It's quite an honor to talk to
Yeah,
you.
no, I appreciate the opportunity, and I would, encourage listeners to go to whiteoakinitiative.org, and there you've got the Landowner for Oak series and stuff like that, right? And get more information on what's going on, background, a lot of what I've talked about and what we've talked about today in this podcast. That information is there and available, right? So I'd encourage everybody to go there, and you've got it. You got resources that support everything we've been talking about.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate
All
it.
right, appreciate it. Thank you.